It's not trying to provide women with yet another rigid life script that says to be a faithful woman and be successful as a woman, you must do these 7 things. But it's to invite women into the fullness of the Bible, trusting that the Holy Spirit is actually what convicts and guides and gives us the fullest expression of what living that abundant life looks like.
Hi again, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Narrative Podcast. Mike Andrews, joined by both bears today. Yes. Aaron and Maria in the studio. It's good to see you both.
Yeah, Maria, actually, we had a great interview with Emma, and she blurbed Emma's book for her. And so we were like, hey, let's have you jump in with the Emma conversation today.
Emma's awesome.
Emma's great. Yeah. And then we're like, stick around for news too. We'll
why not?
Throw it all in.
It's impromptu. There. We're just rolling with the punches, and we're gonna see what happens. This is one of those meals where you don't know exactly what you have in the pantry, but you're gonna throw it all together and see if it's any good. But wanted to talk about specifically one major story out of the Supreme Court this week, where the justices ruled 8-1 in favor of a therapist, Kaley Chiles, who had taken her appeal up to the Supreme Court because she said there was some viewpoint discrimination around conversion therapy and not being able to bring the biblical perspective.
You have to say so-called conversion therapy. You have to use all of the
We're not
finger
video.
air quotes.
I can't.
But they can feel the quotes, air quotes,
I don't know.
when you say
conversion
therapy.
We're going to have to ask
you guys
our
should
listeners.
have, until we have video, you should have one of those court reporter people in here who make sketches of what you look like while you're recording, and then you just
I don't think anybody wants that.
Yeah, especially when David hasn't had a haircut in a while. But
yes.
Anyway.
But anyway, the story was a big win for free speech, and certainly in terms of just things we're seeing around LGBTQ issues specifically lately. This was a big one that we wanted to highlight.
Well, and this is a big win for a whole lot of reasons, because this issue, these so-called conversion therapy laws, have been really an attack weapon of the left for the better part of 15 years now. I mean, I remember fighting these things when I was in Arizona, and there was nothing that made Republican politicians head for the hills like a conversion therapy ban law coming on. And so first we need to define what a conversion therapy law is. That these conversion therapy ban laws, what they do is they ban any therapy or counseling or medical procedure that would try to get someone to change their sexual orientation, and really only one way.
Right.
Hang on. Okay, so one of the main problems with these bans on so-called conversion therapy is that it's so much broader than what you just said, because it could involve, if a person comes and says, I have this unwanted same-sex attraction and I'd like to try to live a heterosexual life, can you help me do that? The therapist is by law not allowed to help that person if that's what they request. So it is not the case that you just had swaths of like Christian therapists across the country who were like, I know you came in here and you said you were gay, but I'm going to spend my working hours with you trying to convince you out of that. That's not what was happening.
Well, no, and it's even worse. The picture they were painting in all of these situations was they were saying they would bring forth, there's all these camps where kids are getting shock therapy to shock away the gay, or their kids are being locked in closets by counselors or pastors to tell them to pray away the gay. And yeah, I mean, they painted this picture of there's counselors all over the country advertising themselves as saying, hey, you're gonna come in here for counseling, and then we're gonna find out you're gay, and we're gonna try to straighten you out in that. And they paint just these really horrifying stories. Meanwhile, what they were really going after were really pulpits and pastors and counselors that wanted to be able to counsel people in God's ways away from homosexuality and towards holiness and towards his ways. And again, having seen these laws get introduced, this was one of the big things really post Obergefell that the left has been bringing all over the country to try to use as sort of like a political bludgeon on conservatives. And they could never actually show places where these things, these like terrible, like pray away the gay or whatever type stories were actually happening. So that's the first aspect of it. The second aspect of it, though, that always made me upset was that what was the real conversion therapy that was always happening, which was the conversion therapies they were doing in children's hospitals trying to convert kids. They weren't covering under this. This was always banning a one-way street of conversion, right? So it was always anybody that wanted to talk to somebody with same-sex attraction to talk to them about pursuing holiness or not pursuing pursuing a gay lifestyle or homosexuality. That was the thing they were trying to ban, never anything else the other way around. And so these laws had become, one, they started being passed in some states like Colorado, and then you really saw them getting passed in cities. So in Ohio, anywhere from 14 to 16 municipalities passed them. I mean, I know of one ministry that was having to operate just outside of Cincinnati to help people that were looking for, again, just healthy sexual behavior counseling, because Cincinnati passed one of these conversion therapy bans. And most of the time, these things had really not been challenged legally. Like, I think for a lot of us looking at them, it's kind of like the Johnson Amendment, where we felt really confident that this was blatantly unconstitutional. The bottom line was they hadn't really been challenged in court yet, and this was the one big case starting in 2019 that started slowly moving through the courts before it got up to the Supreme Court.
Well, and we should note that in other parts of the world, laws like these have gone, I think, in a logical direction, but much farther. So I actually covered this for Christianity Today in 2021 because there was a proposal for an anti-conversion therapy law in the UK, and something had passed already in Victoria, Australia. In Australia, it applied to churches, and there was at least the threat of prosecution. I don't know if it went forward, because a church had read Romans 1, and they counted that as conversion therapy because it discusses sexual sin.
Wasn't there just a situation of this in the UK too, where a woman was? It was like a Dutch prime minister.
Finnish.
There it is.
Yes,
something weird.
She'd written a pamphlet for her church about homosexuality,
like 10 years ago, and she was a sitting parliamentarian.
Still is, yeah. She was just fined. She lost her case essentially. Yeah. She was fined under the Finnish War Crimes Act,
right?
Because she spoke about homosexuality in Christian church.
And that's the nature of what these laws, and that's why this win is so big, because it's killing a really dangerous ideology that's taken root in a lot of the Western world, and led to a lot more severe enforcement. That's, again, it reminds me a little bit, if Mahan were here, he'd appreciate this. It reminds me a little bit of the medical marijuana talk, where it was like, oh no, we just want to legalize medical marijuana. Well, actually, we want to do recreational marijuana. Well, actually, we want to put weed in everybody's candies and lunches and snack packs. And it's just everywhere now, right? We just want to stop this shock therapy, these evil counselors that are trying to abuse gay kids. But eventually you see, especially in Europe and Canada, where they want to take these speech restrictions. So getting a win like this right now in such a convincing matter is huge.
Yeah, and it's still prevalent in the culture. I know we didn't specifically talk about covering this, but thinking of the Bulls player, Jaden Ivey, who was just cut this week because he made comments against the NBA's
literally just saying LGBTQ lifestyle is unrighteous, which is like core Christian belief.
Right. And just blew up. He got cut, and then you just see people riding to the fight on both sides. Thankfully, there have been some other NBA players who have stood up for his right to speak out.
I haven't seen who else has spoken up. I'm sure the kid at Orlando.
Who used to play for the Cavs, and he's in Detroit now, I think. And then there was, I want to say it was somebody in Philadelphia on the 76ers who said, hey, if you're going to cut him, you might as well cut me, because I believe the same thing. So a couple of players have.
Well, and Jonathan Isaac down on the Magic, he's been really strong on these issues as well. So that's I hadn't seen that yet. That's super encouraging.
Well, in the Ohio High, Travion Henderson, who's now playing for the Patriots, came out and he supported his right to say it.
That guy's the coolest.
Then unfortunately, Mike Vrabel had to kind of ruin the whole thing. And
are you serious?
Yeah, he said something to the effect of, well, I appreciate how passionate Travion is for his beliefs, but we need our players to be more educated, or something like that. It was just a major L.
For one Buckeye on Buckeye crime there. That's a
that's a good way to put it.
That's a bummer. Again, I will say, to me, the other thing about this case though that really jumped out that's huge is it was an 8-1 victory, right? The fact that you got Kagan, the fact that we got Sotomayor, for goodness sake, on our side on this. Ketanji Brown Jackson, we're never going to get her on anything because she wants to get her ticket to the Oscars every time, and it does. Again, even that in and of itself, this is such blatant First Amendment violations for the government to say, especially, again, the way the Colorado law was written, for licensed counselors who are licensed by the state. You cannot counsel patients in this way, right? If a patient is coming, to Maria's case, if a patient is coming to you and saying, I have unwanted same-sex attraction, right? I am pursuing homosexuality. I don't want to. Can you help me? And this is causing misery in my life, all of these things. In Colorado, they were banned from trying to help that person. Even as a Christian counselor, they were banned from being able to do that and maintain their license. That is such a baseline clear violation of free speech that the government cannot do that, especially for a religious individual. And to not get, for a Supreme Court justice like Ketanji Brown Jackson to not understand that, again, it's one more thing. The more I process and debrief everything that happened at the City Club, just one more sort of peg in the ground here on how far apart we are from the left right now.
Well, I think that's why you saw Kagan and Sotomayor, because that was exactly the point they made, which it's not even about protecting the free speech rights of religious therapists, which that is critical to do, and that is a welcome result here. But to decide any other way in this case would undermine the concept of therapy itself, because if there's not, and I think Gorsuch wrote this, if there's not a consensus that therapy is supposed to be evidence-based and scientifically rigorous, then that by its nature has to be independent from law. You can't have an entity that is not the scientific basis or the researchers or the doctors in that room telling those doctors what they can say. Otherwise, why would you even license something called therapy? You just go to, I don't know, your state house and ask your legislator what you should do or not do. And I just want to say the other, I think, third rail here is that I want to be very careful and as charitable as I can, because I recognize this is not going to be...
We don't do that on this podcast.
Well, I'm going to.
On your podcast, you have to be charitable.
Listen.
On our podcast, we don't do that. So
that's how I live my life.
Exactly. Let it rip.
This is not true in every case, but it is ridiculous to me that we are not allowed to be more open about this, that it is undeniable that there is a very strong correlation between kids who have been sexually abused, who then present as having same-sex attraction or some kind of sexual dysfunction or disorder. And if you're proposing that you can't, through therapy, again, evidence-based, scientific, medical therapy, try to help a kid who's struggling with that, maybe not every person who's dealing with same-sex attraction has been abused, but the number is way higher than among the heterosexual and general population. If you're going to cut off therapy for those kids, imagine the number of kids who desperately need help who won't get it, because that would, be illegal to talk to them about.
That's the kind of third rail I like to hit on here. That again is one of these things that nobody wants to acknowledge about this situation, and one of the things the left has been doing to these professions of cutting off more and more of our ability to even just have honest conversation about the very clear evidence and data we see out there in these areas.
Yeah, and certainly there is some room for therapists too to be able to decide what's best for their patient, right? Like you're not going to just tell somebody
or to draw on their expertise.
Right.
Exactly.
Like we've seen the argument with like anorexia. Like you don't just tell them, "Oh, you're fine." You're like, yeah, we're not going to treat that. Or imagine couples counseling if you were to go in and the person's there because they want to save their marriage. Oh, I can't help you save your marriage.
You should get
help.
divorced. Yeah,
exactly.
exactly.
Like there has to be some actual turning over of the expertise to the expert.
And there has to be an appeal to reality, right? In the same way, like you mentioned the anorexia example, but if a person comes in and says, I'm obviously a woman, but I feel like I want to be a boy, a therapist, in order for therapy to have any integrity whatsoever, has to be able to say, okay, well, you're not. How do I help you cope with reality? That's the whole point of any and all therapy. And if they're not allowed to say that, which, let's be clear, under this proposed ban in Colorado, they would not be allowed to. In fact, they would be forced to give into that delusion. Then therapy is useless at best and actively harmful at worst.
So there's one other aspect of this that I don't want to go unmissed. And I know a lot of times we'll get accused of being so pro-Trump here. But the Trump administration came into this case in defense of the therapist, in defense of her religious freedom rights and free speech rights here, which, guys, I just can't overstate how this issue would make Republicans run for the hills for the last 10 to 12 years.
You said that at the beginning, and did you mean they don't want to support the therapist?
No, they came in defense of the therapist. They filed a brief.
No, when you say Republicans typically have a run for the hills.
Oh yeah, they typically wouldn't defend. They wouldn't touch this issue with a 10. Yeah, they'd be embarrassed. They would be afraid of the messaging of it, right?
Because of those outlier issues where there have been abuses that have been that have taken
the
place around like those.
And the way the media, again, even the way the media has covered this case, right? You just Google the Chiles case, and you will see every story. Oh, they struck down these conversion therapy bans, and here's the quotes of these people who were so abused and all.
Ketanji Brown Jackson in her dissent said that this was going to be actively dangerous.
Right. That's it's the same thing as the pediatric gender clinics of just kids are going to die now, right? That's their answer to everything, right? Bodies in the streets,
grave harm. That's what she said. It risks grave harm.
And the fact that we have an administration that actually came in on the right side of this issue, that filed a brief in favor of religious freedom, in favor of the therapist here, is such a different day that would be the type of thing to get a governor or an attorney general or let alone a president to speak out on a conversion therapy ban would be almost impossible. Honestly, when these laws would show up at the State House, people would run for the hills on these things. And so this is such a new day on these types of issues. That's so encouraging. And again, even too, this is the fact that they weighed in on this case, which isn't just we've sort of turned the political tide on the transgender issue on boys and girls sports and hormones on kids and surgeries on kids. Thankfully, we've turned the corner there. This is a whole other degree of we're just not going to listen to the left's political threats. We're not going to buy into their scare tactics around conversion therapy. That's such a huge win for us on this. That's a new day in this work that, again, I haven't seen in 15 years.
Well, obviously, we needed to cover a lot of ground, a lot of different angles with that story, but we want to leave plenty of time for our interview with Emma Waters and her new book, Lead Like Jael. What a great book and what a great conversation it was. This will be really, really encouraging.
CCV gets a shout out in it too. We didn't even mention that with her on there. There's a CCV reference in there.
She talks about the panel that she did at the Essential Summit last year.
Wow. Listen, if you guys, what's the narrative? Email address that we have. It's the narrative at CCV.
It's just the narrative at ccv.org. Yep.
All right, if you can find us the reference on that, we'll give you a free two free tickets to the Essential Summit next year. If you can
look at
email us the page.
Interactive. We have reached the age of interactivity on the narrative.
Within the next 15 minutes.
Exactly. Buy Emma's book, read it, and send us what page
take a picture of the
exactly
page so that we know that you have
a picture of you holding it
outside the summit,
wearing a CCV t-shirt
with a receipt from the bookstore.
Send us the page that she's on. We'll give you 2 tickets to the Essential Summit this year because it's fun that we have meaningful conversations at this. And she talks about the panel that she did with Rosaria Butterfield and Maria. It just shows, as we've been talking about the Essential Summit, the prayer we wanted with that event is to have real meaningful conversation. And you can see the type of things that we were able to cover there. So it's
My favorite thing about Lead Like Jael is that way too often when we talk about what Christian women are called to, it has to do with the roles that they're called to play. Mom, mother, which are things women are generally called to, and that's a beautiful gift. She's women are called to cultivate virtue. which is what every Christian is, but it looks different for women and men. And I love that she wrote a book kind of dedicated to the virtues women should cultivate.
Yeah. Well, the conversation with Emma Waters is coming up next on The Narrative. You're invited to join Center for Christian Virtue for our 2026 Columbus Celebration Gala on Saturday, April 11th. It's going to be a great night where you can join us to celebrate what God is doing through CCV. We're excited to welcome our keynote speaker, Scott Jennings, who is CNN's senior conservative voice and one of the sharpest commentators in the national spotlight. He's known for his clarity, conviction, and humor. And Scott brings decades of experience at the crossroads of politics and media, including service in the George W. Bush White House and key roles in multiple presidential and Senate campaigns. It is going to be an elegant evening where you'll enjoy an incredible dinner followed by visionary keynotes exploring the path forward for the future of Ohio and America. Do not miss it. Sponsor a table today. Visit ccv.org/gala for more information. That's ccv.org/gala.
If you've got something to say, we want to help you say it. I'm Vince Tornero. Since 2018, Westler Media has helped churches, organizations, and events amplify their message through podcast, video, and social media. We also happen to produce The Narrative too. Let's talk. WestlerMedia.com. WESSLER Media.com.
We are back on The Narrative. Mike Andrews, Aaron Baer, Maria Baer joining us to talk now with Emma Waters, who is a senior policy analyst in the Center for Technology and the Human Person at the Heritage Foundation. Her work primarily focuses on family biotechnology and reproductive medicine, but she's joining us today because she's got a new book out called Lead Like Jael, 7 Timeless Principles for Today's Women of Faith. And Emma, we're so excited to get to talk to you about your book.
It's so good to be with you guys today. I've been looking forward to it.
All right, it's going to kill me if I don't say it off the bat, but for a book about Jael, you really nailed it. I just needed to get that out of my... I knew I would get a boo on that. It's so worth it.
I'll just say that Maria already made that pun in her recommendation of the book where it puts a stake in the ground or a tent peg for
just clever wordplay all around.
That's good.
But in all seriousness, Emma, I do want to ask you, Jael's not the most obvious person in the Bible that you would pick as the example of what a biblical woman should be. So can you talk a little bit about the inspiration that she gave you to form the outline for this book?
Yes, absolutely. So I don't know about you guys, but sometimes the biblical femininity discourse can lean towards pink and flowery and very emotionally based and feel sometimes a little superficial for the depth that many women are looking for what it means to be a wise, godly, and faithful woman today. And on the other hand, you have many feminist narratives who have really tried to subvert women in the Bible and say characters like Jael are actually subverting the patriarchy. They're throwing off the expectations of their time. They're fighting just like men and really showing Christians that to be a strong woman actually means to be a feminist like we understand it today. And so Jael's story in particular really drove a tent peg, if you will, into the heart of that girl boss feminism discourse, or maybe the tradwife movement, overly sentimental approach to femininity that we see today in some circles, and says that to be a strong and faithful woman can actually look very unconventional and maybe a bit unexpected. And so I wanted to highlight Jael not only for these incredible spiritual lessons that we can dive into on the podcast, but because I thought she would wake readers up and sort of get them to re-engage with the depth of the Bible and start thinking anew about what it means to be a godly woman today.
Well, specifically, the tent peg is something that you pull out of her story, not as a weapon, so to speak, in the sense that she used it to give Israel victory over their enemies, but just in terms of how a woman can think of that iconography to structure their home. So can you get into a little bit more of that to just help set sort of the broad picture for the book?
Yes. So for those of you who are not as familiar, the story of Jael is found in Judges chapter 4 and 5 in the Old Testament. Israel is at war with the Canaanites yet again, and as the battle rages on, Israel is gaining victory over the Canaanites, God's enemy. And so the general stumbles out and finds his way at Jael's tent. Now, the text tells us right off the bat that Jael sees him from afar and recognizes him, so that when he comes and asks for some water and a place to rest, she's ready. belly, and she gives him a warm glass of milk and says, "Here's a soft place to lay down." Now, the moment he falls asleep, she takes a wooden tent peg and mallet and drives it through this evil general's skull, thus soundly defeating Israel's enemy. And to be very clear, the takeaway for women today is not the promotion of physical violence, but there's these incredible spiritual lessons that I thought were so profound, especially for women today and the battles that we're fighting. And so first and foremost, what really struck me in Jael's story is that a wooden tent peg and mallet were actually feminine domestic tools that would have been used by Jael and other homemakers in that time to secure their tent from outside forces and elements. So Jael was uniquely equipped for this extraordinary act of faithfulness because she had been faithful to her daily duties and responsibilities as a wife and homemaker. That was actually the means by which God used her for this incredible act of bravery. The second is that Jael didn't go out seeking the enemy. She didn't pick up a sword and run into battle with the other men. And in fact, no woman in the canonical Bible ever picks up a sword to fight. But she actually was uniquely equipped to fight using these feminine domestic tools. And so it's this idea that to fight as women and to be a godly woman isn't to take on the masculine life script and versions of fighting that men do, but to actually cultivate these uniquely feminine approaches that actually flow naturally from faithfulness to those godly callings of marriage, motherhood, homemaking, and faithfulness in your given season of life. And then finally, as I mentioned at the beginning, she was politically engaged in what was happening around her. So she wasn't like some of the online tradwife movement who say, well, politics, the culture battle, that's for my husband to figure out. I'm just going to bury my head in the sand or only focus on what's happening in my home and let other people fight the battle. Because the reality is that from Genesis to Revelation, we see one of many consistent themes, which is that the enemy always attacks the home. And so to be a faithful wife, mother, and woman is to be a woman who is equipped and prepared to fight sin and evil when it comes knocking at your door. Because it's not a question of if evil comes, but when evil comes to attack you and your family and the place that you reside. And so like Jael, we need to be ready to root out and drive a stake through sin and utterly defeat it, not to play footsies with it or play nice or be naive about the dangers that are around us.
Well, Emma, I've got a question for you. As you were writing this book, the sort of conventional wisdom as you're writing is you're supposed to have someone in mind that you're writing it to or writing it for. Tell me about the woman you had in mind when you were writing Lead Like Jael.
So this is a fantastic question. The women that I really had in mind were women much like myself just a couple of years ago. So Lead Like Jael starts off in the preface about my time in college. My now husband, but then boyfriend, and I were dating. We had fallen madly in love and were starting to talk about marriage when all of a sudden the C word came up, or children. And I had a complete meltdown and realized that I had imbibed so much of the feminist message that children would ruin my life, that I was outright terrified of getting married and having kids because it felt like it was a complete rejection of everything that I had worked for in academics, graduating valedictorian, and excited to start work, in the real world of Washington, D.C. And so as I was thinking about this book and thinking about that season of my life, one of the most pivotal moments in my journey occurred when a mentor of mine came to me and she said, well, Emma, you can either trust what the Bible says, that children are a blessing, or you can trust what you're feeling, which is that children will ruin your life. But you can't both be correct. So you're probably going to need to figure this one out. And it was this incredibly clarifying moment for me where I realized how far I had strayed from what the Bible said about what it means to be a godly woman. And whether you're actively married or having kids or still just in college and thinking about these things, I thought about the women who were in these key moments of transition, graduating high school, graduating college, in their 20s and early career, who are really trying to navigate what does success look like? Do I go all in pursuing my career? What does it look like to be open to marriage and to be open to children? And when I find myself in that season, how do I balance all of these competing goods? Because they are certainly good expressions of what it means to be a woman. The question is, how do you order them in a way that actually puts first things things first and honors God. And so it's that demographic of women, especially 18 to 30, who are really in the thick of it, that I wanted to equip and empower. Because the reality is that I hear this time and time again, whether I'm speaking at a conference, a university, or even on the Hill. I'll do a presentation on a policy area that I'm working on, and then half the questions I get at the end have nothing to do with the policy areas, and they're like, yeah, set all of that aside. How does one get married today? How do you manage this dynamic of being a mother and working? What does it look like to date in this like fractured environment? And I realized that for all of the big picture conversations we're having about declining birth rates and declining marriage rates and the fracturing of the American family, the very real questions that women are asking are getting at the heart of these competing goods, the fears that they have around it, and the hunger that they have for this truly life-giving vision of abundant life that really speaks to them as women and not as just these pseudo-masculine, females out in the workforce.
Well, and what I loved about your book, Emma, is that you didn't offer what too often happens with, I think, books that are sometimes sold as, help for women to learn what it means to be a godly woman. And sometimes I have a little bit of a PTSD hangover with even that phrase, because for so many years, I feel like in these kinds of conversations, to be a godly woman was a very specific role-based prescription. It was, you must get married by, some certain age, to maximize fertility. You must have children. You must stay home. And, of course, I've reached a point in my life. I've been blessed to have all of those gifts. I've, got married relatively young. We have children. And I know now that, for me, there is no greater source of meaning and contentment, and also just an opportunity to rise to the occasion, I think, of serving the Lord as those gifts specifically. But it hurt me in the seasons of my life when I wasn't there yet to feel like being a woman meant filling those actual roles. Whereas your book, I think, paints a picture of being a woman as cultivating virtues. And a lot of these virtues are available to both men and women. We're all called to cultivate virtue, but the level and the kind of virtue and how we express them are going to be different. And I love that, your tent peg strategy here has virtues like discernment, shrewdness, resourcefulness, hospitality, things, of course, men and women are both capable of, but some of these are, have unique expression as women that we can and seek. What do you think are some of the messages coming from outside to women about whether it's in terms of cultivating virtue, if they'd give it that language, or what kinds of lives that they're supposed to be leading that would oppose the picture that you're painting here?
Oh, this is, a fantastic question. And I think so much that can be said here. Two of the things that I really had in mind when writing the book, I think reflect some of the extremes we see from girl boss feminism and the tradwife movement more broadly. So on the one hand, if you take certain expressions of the tradwife movement that says to be a woman is to get married and have kids, I think we can sometimes have too narrow a view of our calling as women in life. So the worst expressions of this are versions that say, well, women don't need an education. They don't need to go to college because you don't need those things to get married and have kids. So just go do those things that you're called to do. But ultimately, getting married and having kids is not an end in itself. It is yet another expression of biblical wisdom and godly faithfulness, one that is a very, very high calling for women in the Bible, but it is not an end itself. So in chapter 6 on motherhood, for example, I use the analogy of my dad taking us arrowhead hunting growing up and how he would teach us to distinguish between basic flint that was just garbage and actual arrowheads that had been used to hunt and kill game for different tribes. And it struck me in reflecting on that season that motherhood is very much a similar expression where children are like those arrows in our hands that we're not called simply to focus on as ends in themselves, but to actually disciple, discipline, nurture, and form into faithful disciples of Jesus Christ, who we can then launch out into the world to continue on far beyond us the great work that God has called us to. But if we have too narrow a view of what it means to be a woman as a wife and mother, we then maybe forego the holistic formation of the virtues and gifts of receiving a good education and learning to think deeply and all of these different expressions of what it means to be a woman. So that's on the one side, I think, that could push back and say, well, women don't need to do anything in the public space. Their one goal is this thing, right? And I think that kind of misses the point. And it also misses the way that technology has advanced in ways that are actually very beneficial for women. So post-COVID, I think one of the greatest blessings coming out of COVID is the rise of remote and flexible work, where institutions that never would have allowed people to work outside of being inside the office 40 hours a week are now very open to women working during nap times and early in the mornings or late at night, and doing so in a home-based way that actually reinforces the good of the family and can be done without detracting from the good of your children. And that can look different in different seasons depending on what someone wants to do. But that's actually one of the things that I explore throughout the book is we don't need to have an all or nothing mindset. It's not either you work or you stay at home, but actually there's maybe really creative expressions of those things that allow us to put first things first when it comes to the needs of our children and family, but still pursue these other goods. And on the other hand, I really dive into this, I think, in chapter 5, which is the chapter on marriage as battle mates, but is really getting into the nature of what it means to be a man and a woman. And so maybe in a way that pushes back pretty hard against the girl boss mantra that says that women are basically just like men and they're called to the same life scripts of success. I really dive into Genesis 1 and 3, looking at the names given to Adam and Eve as a vision or guidelines for what it means to be a faithful man or woman. And so we see Adam given the names of Adam and Ish, which is Adam referring to the earth, his role as the cultivator and provider, and then Ish as husband, as the protector of his wife. Eve is given 3 names. She's the Ezer Kenegdo, or the battle mate. She's then Ishasha, the wife, and then she's Eve, the mother of all living. And this really points to the primary orientation of women who were called to be open to marriage and to children as their primary responsibilities when they're in that season. Of course, if you're not, then that's a different season and calling that you have. But to be open to and faithful to those seasons, and then let everything else flow from there. So, of course, we want husbands to play with their children. And there's nothing in the Bible that says women can't or shouldn't work outside the home, as long as that work is not in competition with or undermining the good of her family. And so in thinking about these 7 virtues or disciplines, I was really looking at not a comprehensive list by any means, but where do we see the biggest lack in women today? So I start off right off the bat with discernment, and discernment compared to toxic empathy. And so many of the emotional messages sold to women that are really trying to get them to set aside God's word and what they know to be true for this sort of feel-good desire to be kind and loving that often just like affirms lies, right? Or shrewdness as a way of not giving into manipulation or rage or any of these sort of like unvirtuous depictions of what it means to be a woman that you see in different places, but actually this very innocent yet godly and smart, shrewd approach to being faithful to God's word to protect life and maybe more extreme circumstances. And the list goes on and on. But as you said, it's not trying to provide women with yet another rigid life script that says to be a faithful woman and be successful as a woman, you must do these 7 things. But it's to invite women into the fullness of the Bible, trusting that the Holy Spirit is actually what convicts and guides and gives us the fullest expression of what living that abundant life looks like.
So, Emma, in that framework you just laid out, how should Christians today respond to a lot of the narrative around women in the workforce? Particularly around women make 80% of, the left uses this all the time. Women make 80% that men make for the same jobs. How should we be thinking about those conversations, responding to them, and not just from a debunking the myths, because we know a lot of the stats and numbers they throw around are nonsense. But there's an underlying value statement they're making there as well. How should we actually be thinking about those conversations today?
So the underlying value statement that you often hear is that the best and primary place for a woman to be, whether she's single wife or mother of children of any age, is that she should be in the workforce. And anything that keeps her from being fully present in the workforce is somehow detracting from her fullest expression of who she is.
Can I just point out for a second too how ironic that is? Because this is always coming from the same crowd that tends to have a very wary, at best, view of capitalism, right? Like the idea of working for a living and making money, like we are just this disgusting capitalist society. But then at the same time, the only real way to be a good woman is to work. If I were the enemy, this is the exact kind of strategy I would use. But I want to let you finish.
Yeah, great. I didn't have time to get into this in the book, but there's a really funny strand of women who actually hate girl boss feminism because it's this gross capitalist scheme to force women.
Right.
At least they're consistent.
Yeah.
And so it's basically like you should be a tradwife, but don't actually be a tradwife because we're opposed to traditional women, but don't be a corporate girly either. And you're like, well, okay, at some point this is a lose-lose
Yeah,
situation.
pick a lane, guys.
You're going to have to land the plane, yeah.
Yeah. But you see this all the time. Yes. Okay. So you have examples of recently The View went after another young mom who at CPAC told women to get married young and have lots of babies. And that was just an unqualified good in your life that you should be open to and pursuing. And so The View, for example, went into this long tirade about how it was irresponsible to give this advice to women. It's too expensive to have children. So they said it requires over $400K a year to provide for childcare and all the costs of children. And I mean, my husband and I have 2 girls and 1 on the way, and we're not making anywhere near $400K.
Hey, congrats. Is that news? Is that breaking news on the narrative here? That
Not
you have
breaking
another
news,
dang
but
it.
surprise.
One day we're going to get into breaking news here anyway.
Not
You
today.
will. But
Yeah.
it's this idea that it's too costly to have children. But what's the assumption that they're making? That the woman must be working full time and then therefore be able to hire a cadre of other women primarily to care for their children through daycare, which is extremely expensive, through meal preparation and delivery, through dry cleaning and home cleaning and all the services that have to be built up to support this economy of 2 two income workers at all times. And so, and this is what you see oftentimes from the left where they say, well, women have to work because of poor economic situations. And that is certainly the case for many women. But then they say, therefore, the best solution we can offer you is universal daycare and maybe some form of like 6-week paid maternity leave that'll give everyone time off. But those are just tinkering with a system that's already tilted towards women in the workforce rather than radically rethinking it and say, actually, what does it look like to say it is good for mothers of young children to be able to be the primary caregivers? And what can we do as a society to enable that? Whether that's using the daycare block grant, much like an ESA or an education savings account, where you're just given the money as a parent and you can either give the money to a daycare to take care of your kids or to grandma or to your sister or to yourself. And it's actually your money that you're paying into the system through your taxes that you can then distribute in a way that works best for your family. So that's one side of the conversation that I think has really been used to frame women as primarily economic outside the house workers rather than actually viewing them more holistically in the primary relationships they have. And frankly, if you look at most studies, while there's about the same number of women working today, whether they have children or not, most women with young kids either want to be part-time or they want flexible work. The question is, how can we, as the policies that we enact, the churches and local communities that we have, the family units, really rethink the way that we've shaped society to enable women to opt out or scale down depending on what they're interested in and the season of life that they're in.
I wonder too if I have a hypothesis that, I've seen the same studies that women prefer either part-time work or flexible work or something like that. And I wonder if what a lot of women are craving isn't necessarily that kind of economic agency, because we do see women and families making, what sometimes can appear to be irrational economic choices to subsidize her working. Like, so, even The View would argue that some families spend more on childcare than they bring in on the second salary that the childcare makes possible. So there's something else that women maybe are craving as opposed to simply more money when they say they want things like flexible work. And my hypothesis is that women want what every human being wants, which is a sense of accomplishment, a sense that they're living a life that other people admire. Measurable, being able to meet measurable goals. And sometimes being a parent of very, very small children does not offer those kinds of things. So are there other ways that we as Christians, certainly as a church, but also as a larger community, can offer those kinds of things to women without it being purely economical?
So there are two ways that I would take this. The first is that we need to have a complete reinvigoration of the status around what it means to be a mother, especially in those early years. And that, to your exact point, I think so many women crave something deeply meaningful and worthwhile to really sink their best talents into. And sometimes, especially if you have very young children, it's very emotional and physical to raise a baby, but it's not necessarily as intellectually stimulating as maybe some women would like. And so the question is, how do we create opportunities in the church and our local communities to really utilize and engage the strengths of women? And I think there's been, since the feminist revolution and since second wave feminism especially, there's been such a big push to get women into the workforce that our own communities and for women who are not working or not working full time can feel very lonely and emptied out. And so you see this, I see this all the time where women are like, well, I actually quit work to be with my kids, but I was so lonely because I didn't have a community of other moms to do it with, that I just didn't really have a vision for what it looked like. So I think part of it is restoring this vision of what it means to actually have a productive home that's the center of your life. It's the source of the mission and the work that you and your husband are doing. And you see that in some ways in the Tradwife movement, some ways in the homesteading community. But for those of us who aren't on a farm and homesteading, what does that actually look like today? I think this is like an open question of what we're trying to recover and restore with like a productive home economy. And then at the same time, this is something that Scott Yenner recorded in one of his Era's like Tradwife articles that he wrote a couple of months ago. And there's this one woman who works as a digital designer who said, I work from home a couple hours a day when my kids are napping. And she said, that is the outlet of energy and creativity that I need, that actually gives me the motivation to be the best mother I can be when my kids are awake. And so I think there's also the side of like, what does it look like creatively to find that sort of contract-based flexible work that you can do while your kids are napping or while they're sleeping that may actually give you the sort of creative intellectual outlet that you desire to fuel the rest of your work and rest of your day as a mother. So I think it can be a both and of like restore the home, but also be open to maybe more flexible part-time expressions of creativity in a given season.
So Emma, this is earlier in the conversation, you made a conversation. You mentioned how you were asking yourself, what does success look like? And to me, especially as we're talking about this broader conversation around marriage and family, we have the Family Structure Index coming out here soon, ranking the states on how healthy their family structure is. It comes back to how are we really painting the picture of what does the good life look like for Americans today, right? That's all of the public policy solutions we want to push forward. Really, ultimately, we're dealing with the individual decisions people are making on what they value and what they want to pursue. And what is interesting about your book, especially, is we can talk a lot about the left and feminism and sort of secular culture and all of that. But what's powerful about your book is you were raised in the church, right? You were raised in a Christian community, and even the picture for you was painted to be. And Maria and I would probably share a similar story of that, of what the good life looks like would be maximizing sort of personal freedom. I mean, we got married at 22, and on our agenda was travel and making money and building up as big a careers as possible. What are we getting wrong in the church? Or we got a lot of pastors and Christian school leaders that listen to the pod. How is the church inadvertently raising the next generation up to basically value the same thing as the world does and devalue or make marriage and kids look terrifying?
So this is something I call feminism for thee, but not for me. And this is a trend that I've seen from younger women, from leaders in the church, from parents across the board, all within the Christian context, who they themselves have lived a very traditional life where they've gotten married, they've had kids. Oftentimes the moms are stay-at-home mothers. But then they looked at women in my generation and say, but you have more opportunities than I ever had. You should make the most of this time and get the best degrees that you can and enjoy your career, enjoy being single for a number of years, and don't worry about kids. Those kids will come. And maybe in their mind, they're thinking, oh, they'll delay for 3 to 5 years and then they'll have kids in their late 20s or early 30s and everything will be fine. But the reality is that how this is actually playing out in culture is that it's not just a 2 to 3 year delay. It can be a 5, 10 to 15 year delay where we're so oriented towards those particular career pursuits that we're actually less equipped than ever before to get married. So whereas dating and getting married maybe made natural sense to previous generations because that was so much of their culture, it is now so foreign to young men and women today that they are struggling to go on dates, to ask a girl out, to flirt in a way that's fun and appropriate, and they don't think that a Me Too HR executive is going to call them into their office to talk to them about the way they've been behaving. And all these factors were like men and women are graduating high school without ever having a first kiss. And I'm not saying to be sexually promiscuous in any way, but that there's so much alienation between men and women that I think what previous generations assume will naturally happen is no longer naturally occurring. And Ross Douthat put his finger on this so profoundly in an opinion piece of his a couple of months ago, where he said that in our technologically driven, in the moment generation that we're a part of, everything that is not explicitly articulated will be lost. And so I think the solution is actually maybe far simpler in some ways than we've made it out to be, which is simply that if you are in any position of authority as a mother or a father, a church leader, a pastor, an older, wiser person in the church, a matriarch, if you will, it is your God-given duty and responsibility to explicitly articulate the good life, which means setting marriage up as a good and fruitful relationship that God works through for the refinement and the best flourishing of both men and women as battle mates, not a battle of the sexes. That children are an unqualified good and blessing in your life and are in fact the very thing that aren't only good in of themselves, but are actually for your good as a woman, that they'll refine you and open your eyes to a whole new world than you ever even knew about, and a whole new world of passions and interests that you maybe never knew that you had. But I think so many times what's assumed in older generations is not assumed in my generation. And what needs to be said are just those basic truths preached and taught and shown to the younger generation time and time again. So there was a Barna study that came out in 2025 highlighting how many, as many studies have, where young men are far more likely to attend church and read their Bible and pray, and young women in the same Gen Z category are far less likely to do all of those things. And they're actually far more religiously unaffiliated than ever before. And this Barna study actually said that the solution to the alienation and lack of religiosity and family values we see among young women could actually be the role of older women and this Titus 2 model we see in the New Testament, engaging them in and saying, for all the loneliness, anxiety, and depression that you're experiencing. I mean, Maria, you've written about this extensively, like young women who aren't married and who don't have children are the least happy in America today, because they're given so many choices for what success looks like, and yet no life script or vision for how to order those choices into concrete decisions for their flourishing. And so what does it look like for older women at various stages to really draw them in and show them through their own lives the goodness of marriage and the family and the life that they've built? Because I think for many women, they simply don't have a context for what that looks like. So they're hearing culture say that it's bad and scary and will take your time, your money, your body, and everything else in between. And they're not actually seeing the real fruit and gifts that come from that.
Yeah, and I think the irony too is that it will take a lot of those things. It will definitely take your time and your money and your body and your patience and
your money
and some more of your money and all of that. But this is again where the church can shine, because is not our message to everybody, men, women, and children alike, that in laying down your life, you will find it. right? I mean, that's the central message of the gospel that Jesus gave to us, that he saves us when we lay down our lives and pick up our cross and follow him. So even to tell women, like, don't worry, you will enjoy it more than you think, which I am singing that tune from the rooftops because I truly believe that. And I know women will enjoy it more than they think, and that the kind of scary narratives around getting married and having children that women are fed, mostly from the cultural left, but also from the right sometimes, are usually false. Even though I want to sing that tune, the tune beneath that tune is that it will also be difficult, but meaning is found in the difficult things in life, and that actually the purpose and satisfaction that you're looking for will be found only through sacrifice and self-sacrifice. And it's a paradox, but it's just true.
Yeah, the seed must first die before it can bear much fruit.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Emma, let me ask you this, and not to put the focus on men about a book that you've written for women, but what can we do? Well, of course, just being the raging.
Can we talk about me for a minute now?
Raging sexist that I am would like to talk about men again on this podcast. But, we have roles as dads, as husbands, to develop our daughters. So what would be your encouragement to the men who are listening, who are in those roles, of how can they help their wives, their daughters grow into this godly calling?
This is a fantastic question. And I've often joked that men should be buying Lead Like Jael just as much as women should, because
because you gotta double your market size.
Exactly, right. You don't want to cut it in half.
Beyond the book sells question. But going back to the Titus 2 point, there are sometimes lessons that are best, lessons in conversations that are best had woman to woman and maybe not man to woman. And this is why the Apostle Paul actually turns to older women and says, no, older women, you should be training up younger women. So there's that on the one hand of maybe it's a good idea to have women have some of these conversations with women because it takes some of the pressure off. But then as a dad or a husband, a man in this very godly role, what does it look like to inspire that within your daughters? And I think it's two things. I'm the oldest in my family. I take after my dad the most, and he's an insanely hardworking and ambitious man. And so growing up, I was like, okay, I'm going to be just like my dad. I'm going to be hardworking and smart and savvy. And those are all fantastic things, and what father doesn't want their daughter to do that. And I think the temptation can then be to, as a father, is to then have a particular vision of that success that you as a man would recognize, and then intentionally or unintentionally, as unintentionally very much in my case, passing that down to your daughter. And so instead, what does it actually look like to very intentionally encourage and praise very feminine gifts and callings, not in contrast to, working hard and getting a good education and doing work that you care about, but alongside and as the greater vision of what it uniquely looks like to do these things as a woman. So praising your wife or your mother, depending on the situation, or praising other faithful women who have embodied those things well. I think really being intentional about finding role models for your daughter that she can look up to that actually reflect these virtues and principles is a huge factor, because ultimately you're looking for someone like you to show you the way. And as a father to daughters, you need to play a very intentional role in helping your daughter find those women to look up to, be it your wife and other women in the church and throughout history. So Elizabeth Elliot, Amy Carmichael, all of these incredible examples of faithful women who are doing great work or have done great work for the Lord, and really setting that up as a vision for success. And not saying, well, I've paid so much money for you to get your education, which my father never said to me, but I paid so much money for you to get this education. How could you throw it all away just by becoming a mother 1 year into marriage? Like those sorts of tropes that we hear from parents to their daughters is like the complete opposite. When on the other hand, it should be, I am so glad that you're getting this great education, and here's all the ways it empowers you to be a wonderful woman and mother and wife in the future, and all the ways I'm excited to see these gifts really come to fruition in your life. Things along those lines come to mind.
I would say, too, to just communicate high expectations for the women in your life, your daughters, your wife. And I mean that across the spectrum. High expectations intellectually, sacrificially, spiritually, like engage them in theological conversations, challenge them to be hospitable with other people in your church, to use your home well. Like there's nothing, at least for me, and I think for most people, there's nothing as empowering as someone communicating to me either explicitly or implicitly that they have high expectations, like they think I'm capable of great thought or insight or something valuable to the conversation or whatever. And this again pushes that that kind of narrow view of contribution beyond economics to just, communicating to your daughter or to other women in your church family or in your family that you value their presence in your community as people who think things and can contribute to whatever the conversation or whatever else you're trying to build. That was huge for me growing up. My dad was never very explicit about having, very rigid expectations for me he always made me feel like he thought I was smart, but he was never like, you're going to go to an Ivy League school or you're going to make this much money but he asked me what I thought about things. And he shared with me what he thought about things. And that made me feel like those contributions that I could make were valuable and that he expected me to develop the virtues of shrewdness and discernment and thoughtfulness. That I don't think you can overstate how important that is to young women and probably to everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Emma, before we started the podcast, we were talking a little bit about the reaction to the book, both on the left and the right. Can you share a little bit of how the book's been received so far, and even just this message generally has been something you've been talking about for a while. The New York Times you spoke with about this topic. How is this message being received so far?
Who's mad at you and where do they live?
Exactly.
Well, so thankfully, the demographic that I wrote it for, those women 18 to 30 years old especially, have had a really positive response to this. And it's been deeply encouraging to have women come up to me and say, yes, I feel torn between tradwife and girl boss. And I'm so grateful that someone has a practical and biblically informed resource that I can dive into these questions with. So some women are doing this as a Bible study with their mom or with their mentor, or even in a small group setting, which is precisely what I hoped the book would be used for. So that's been very encouraging that the people I actually wrote it for have had a very positive response. But as with any good book, you should also be making lots of the right people mad. And so in the course of the book, I think I found, in the book coming out especially, I think I found that like older millennial women, especially women who maybe bought into the girl boss lie, didn't get married or didn't have children either till much later or at all, have been really offended by and frustrated by some of the things that I'm saying. And they're calling it too simplistic, misogynistic, Republican talking points. She claims this is a biblical book, but in reality, she's just trying to shove marriage down your throat. A couple of the very
You're getting
amusing...
the bingo card, the full leftist onslaught bingo card. There. That's great. That's awesome.
Yes. As you probably are surprised, Duke Divinity School really mad about it right now, apparently, based on some of the reviews we're getting. And then on the other hand, also not particularly surprising, but newer, is a lot of the, call them far right online men, these ultra trad men that aren't actually, representing, I think, a very biblical vision of masculinity or manhood online, are also really mad because I use the word lead like in my title. So Lead Like Jael, which is rather tongue-in-cheek because I'm trying to, again, be a little playful here about what we're talking about. But they seem really upset, and they've accused me of being a subversive feminist, trying to undermine the women of the Bible. I'm secretly a boss babe who's actually just trying to push my boss babification of the Bible on other women. Wolf in sheep's clothing, you get the idea. So they've been very upset too. I think in one case, I reported a guy to his pastor because I happened to know his pastor and he didn't know that. This is like a very satisfying form
There you go.
of
There's
like,
your breaking news.
There it is. That's good.
But yeah, so, the right people are probably mad, but and mad along the lines that you would expect for a book like this.
The weird thing about that, I get that reaction very occasionally. I mean, it's a very small subset, I think, but every once in a while I'll get emails from people asking me if I, asked for Aaron's permission to say something or whatever. And to be clear,
We're
I
the
never
opposite
ask
here. We're
Aaron's
like,
permission.
did you ask Maria if you could say that, Aaron?
But what's ironic about that is that usually that comes from a worldview that's like women are physiologically incapable of being in charge of anything. But then if that were true, why would they be so threatening, right? And if they were threatening or they were causing harm, then wouldn't that ultimately be a failure on the part of men?
Of the men, if you're being threatened by someone who's weaker than
if you're in charge and something goes wrong, then that's your fault.
Yeah.
So guys, I mean,
someone made the point that oftentimes, I think in cases like that, you're potentially dealing with men who are either incapable or very inefficient at actually leading other men. So they turn their attention to women online that they think that they can. Yeah. It's an interesting
everybody's hurting. Yeah, there's no question. But well, I'm glad to hear that you're taking it in stride and not taking it too seriously, because it can hurt when you feel like what your goal is to use the Bible as wisdom and as the true story of the world to guide your life and how you lead it, and then to have somebody try to use the Bible against you. I know that can, as silly as some of the arguments are, I know that can be difficult. So I'm glad sounds like you're taking it in stride.
So Emma, where are you seeing, this is one of these things, like, I think for a lot of us watching Charlie Kirk's message at the very end of his life in the last maybe 18 months, 2 years of his time with TPUSA, seeing that shift in his message, maybe away less from conservative politics to, listen, this is about marriage and family and kids and Jesus, right? Like, we saw like real clear momentum happening in that TPUSA world around this very important message. Where else are you seeing that? Honestly, I think the other area I would say is Kevin Roberts at Heritage, right? Watching sort of that shift at Heritage of saying, hey, as important as great foreign policy and great economic success, we really, really need to emphasize family formation and the importance of marriage and children. Where else are you seeing that message or this message really take root and see institutions change? Because again, that's every time we start talking about marriage, family, and kids, if we're not talking institutional, we end up sort of talking about anecdotes. So where are you seeing some encouraging shifts there?
Yes. And so this is a question that really plagued me during the book writing process, because as you're pointing out with Charlie Kirk and a number of other places, you're seeing this incredible revival take place among young men toward faith and family. But for young women, there's been a significant lag or stalling out or even outright rejection of those same things. Now, recent studies and some recent polling I've seen has been encouraging that we're maybe at the very beginning of a revival of Gen Z women towards faith and family. They've tasted the fruit of millennial feminism, and they're realizing that they were sold a bag of goods and that they actually really want a very different, very family-oriented, faith-oriented life. But the question throughout writing the book was, am I writing to an audience that exists? Is there going to be this revival of young women really hungry for this? Or am I screaming out into the void, or a very niche Christian circle of women who are already with me? And I'm encouraged because I do think you're starting to see those institutional shifts take place. And some of them are it's far more preliminary. I'll put it that way. So on the one hand, you're seeing women like Olivia Rodriguez and Zendaya, two very prominent actresses, Jessica Buckley, who have all come out with very pro-motherhood messaging, saying, yeah, I've done a lot of great things in my career, but I really want to be a mother. And when I become a mother, I want that to be my priority and the thing that I give my time to. Jessica Buckley at the Oscars, like, just overjoyed, and what comes out of her mouth in that moment of pure passion, it's, I love my husband so much, I want to have 20,000 babies with you, and then singing the praise.
And hang on, I have to point out too that she won the Oscar for a movie about losing a child. That was so beautiful that I couldn't finish it, right? And so when you're sold that having children is too hard, right? And the actual hardest version of having children that I could, or anybody could imagine, would be losing a child. And you have, I mean, her portrayal of that was so, like, deeply human and real that I mean, I read an interview where the director was kind of concerned for Jessie Buckley. Like, this was such an emotional ride for her. To have a woman who portrayed that and really went there emotionally to then say, you know what this made me want to do? Have 20,000 more babies. I feel like that was such a powerful moment. I cried when she gave that speech at the Oscars. I thought it was beautiful. Sorry, I cut you off. Keep going.
No, that's great. I was going to say, this is one of the first times I can actually talk about it with not crying. So
I know.
No, it's great. So I think you're seeing shifts among the elite in Hollywood, and oftentimes with younger women who are starting to rethink their commitments and realize that it's not an all or nothing scenario, and that you can and should prioritize motherhood and children and marriage, and trust that there are also many opportunities and things you can do outside of that. I do think the Heritage Foundation's been one of the best examples of this. I have never seen or worked for another institution in DC that is as pro-family through and through that they are, not just in their policies and maternity leaves and flexible work schedules, but in the culture that they've cultivated within Heritage. So there's a story I think I told when I was speaking out of Hannah with you, Erin, recently, but when I had my first daughter, I came in for a very last minute news hit one afternoon. And the way I'd structured work is my workday ended when she woke up from her nap. And so I had a last minute TV hit scheduled, and I was like, okay, I'm just going to bring her in. One of the secretaries offered to watch her. And so I dropped her off. I ran to the studio to do this 5-minute news hit. And as I was coming back, there was an email from our vice president, and it simply said baby sounds. And my heart dropped because I thought, oh, no, my daughter's been disruptive. This is the first time I'm bringing her in the office. This is terrible. Like, I was so nervous that somehow I would appear unserious or mess up the flow of work, or I don't know, what have you, whatever those fears are that women have early on, especially. And when I opened the email, it simply said, Emma, thank you so much for bringing your daughter into work today. It was such a delight hearing her baby sounds outside my office door. She cooed and talked with our secretary. Your baby is welcome here anytime. And I similarly just started crying because it was such this incredible encouragement of we don't merely value you because of what you bring to the institution, but we value you as a wife and a mother. They were so supportive when we moved to Pittsburgh to support remote work so that my husband could full-time pursue ministry here in seminary, and I could still work and be able to exercise these gifts through this institution. So I think you're seeing a lot of shifts. I think Heritage is probably, again, one of the best examples of it, but even in places like TPUSA, where Erica Kirk has now taken over in Charlie's stead, very much his request and vision from what it seems. And yet she's using her platform not as this girl boss babe, here's how we're going to take over, I don't know, fill in the blank conservative world. But so many of her podcasts and so many of her interviews have been about the goodness of marriage and motherhood, what it looks like to be a battle mate with your spouse, the calling of a woman, and really challenging young women to rethink the life scripts that they've been sold in a way that even in conservative ink, you still have this untouchable third rail of feminism of we're conservatives, but we're boss babe conservatives who work 80 hours a week out of the home. Yeah. And so I think there's just a really big shift, like Isabel Brown at Daily Wire and Claire Booth Luce Center and a number of these organizations that are really reorienting themselves around the goodness of being a woman as a wife and mother, not in competition to your work, but as something that actually is the dominant good in your life in that season, that work can sort of be built out around it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Emma, it is always so great to hear from you. Before we let you go, can you tell everybody where they can find your book and where can they follow your work?
Yes. So Lead Like Jael, 7 Timeless Principles for Today's Women of Faith is sold on Amazon, in stores and online with Barnes & Noble, and anywhere else books are sold. And you can follow my work on X at EML Waters and on Instagram at EML_Waters. And of course, if you search Emma Waters, the Heritage Foundation, many of my articles and commentary will come up there as well.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Narrative, presented by CCV and produced by Wessler Media. If you found today's episode insightful, leave us a review or rating and subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. We're your hosts, Mike Andrews, Aaron Baer, and David Mahan, and we'll see you next time on The Narrative.